Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Your word, O Lord, is true. Consecrate us in the truth. Hallelujah. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus was teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and a woman was there who for 18 years had been crippled by a spirit. She was bent over, completely incapable, standing erect. When Jesus saw her, he called to her and said, "Woman, you are set free of your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and she at once stood up straight and glorified God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant that Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, said to the crowd in reply, "There are 6 days when work should be done. Come on those days to be cured, not on the Sabbath day." The Lord said to him in reply, "Hypocrites! Does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his ass from the manger and lead it out for watering? This daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 years now, ought she not to have been set free on the Sabbath day from this bondage?" When he said this, all his adversaries were humiliated, and the whole crowd rejoiced at all the splendid deeds done by him. The Gospel of the Lord. What is the meaning of the Sabbath? There is a large misunderstanding in our age about the Sabbath, just as there was in the days of Jesus. Many people in our day, right, they refer to the Sabbath as the day of rest. Right? Now, it's not necessarily a bad way to think about the Sabbath, but it doesn't really get at the heart of what the Sabbath is about. Just as in the days of Jesus, right, some of these Pharisees in the synagogues, right, they considered the Sabbath as merely a day of rest, and therefore no work should be done. But the Sabbath is not merely a day of rest. The Sabbath, in many ways, was like the heart of the law of the Old Testament. There are all these different rules and regulations in the laws of the Old Testament. But one of the first and most important laws is to keep holy the Sabbath day. And why? The Sabbath day is not merely a day of rest. Rather, the Sabbath day is to be different from all other days. For 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Why? Why should you rest on the Sabbath day? Because the Sabbath day is the day set aside for God. Adam and Eve, when they were in the garden, right, when God taught them about the Sabbath, when he rested on the 7th day, it was supposed to be a reminder to Adam and Eve that the 7th day was the day that they were to imitate God himself, the day that they were supposed to be in communion with God. And for us modern Catholics, right, the Sabbath day is still supposed to be that. It is supposed to be our day for communion with God. I think it would be a very good thing for us to consider as Catholics is really taking seriously this law of the Sabbath day. Not only to come to Mass, right, which I'm sure that all of us here in this church this morning, right, we do come to Mass, but to have the entire day set aside for God. A day in which earthly labor and earthly work do not take us away from communion with God. A day unlike all other days where we don't waste time in front of the television or in front of a computer. Setting the day aside for God. As a priest, you guys know that I have a day off once a week, right? And usually when people ask me about my day off, right, I try to change the way they talk about it. I call it my Sabbath day. It is the day in which I am supposed to be in communion with God. And therefore, I leave Crawfordsville. I leave the office. Right? Because I, too, need a day to remind myself that I am meant to be in communion with God. Isn't it a perfect analogy here of this woman who was unable to stand erect, right? She was literally bent over, and Christ liberated her on the Sabbath so that she could once again look up to heaven. The Sabbath day for us is the day that we look to heaven. Instead of all of our earthly labors and our earthly anxieties. I think it would be a wonderful thing if, as Catholics, we made the Sabbath day a much more serious practice. And not just the Sabbath days, but also the holy days, right? Holy days of obligation, right? Instead of only coming to Mass, right? Setting the day aside, right? As a day for communion. And it used to know a priest who, he had a young adult group, and they made a point of every time there was a holy day of obligation, these young adults, they had a great big party, right, to celebrate the solemnity. I think all of us as Catholics could do a better job of taking the Sabbath more seriously, but not just for the sake of being without sin or something like that, but really for our own well-being. In many ways, our modern culture is a culture of constant busyness, constant occupations and anxieties and tasks. And one of the things we need in our modern age more than anything else is a true respect for the Sabbath. That one day a week, we set a day aside to remind ourselves of our true destiny and our true dignity, communion with God.